Thank you for those who are here for the press conference. We are waiting for a few more folks, so we will get started very shortly. Thanks for your patience. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Hyun Brindle Kim, the Research Director at Jobs to Move America, and I want to welcome you to our press conference to unveil a new groundbreaking report prepared by researchers identified with Columbia Labor Lab, along with Jobs to Move America staff who have prepared the research and an impacted worker. I will introduce each speaker as they are introduced to speak, and we will put their correct spelling and title in the chat. When all the speakers are finished, you will be able to ask questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please start queuing up those questions when you have them. So Jobs to Move America is a national research and policy center that works to ensure that public investments in manufacturing create good jobs and healthy communities across the US. We began this work several years ago and have surveyed more than 600 workers in the Hyundai Kia companies and supply chains in Alabama and Georgia. We partnered with Columbia Labor Lab, one of the nation's leading labor research institutions, whose report provides the first rigorous large-scale analysis of the economic impact of captive labor in a US manufacturing supply chain. You will be hearing from several of those experts today. If you have not received the report, please indicate that in the chat and we will send you a link to that report, which is live now. Workers in Alabama and Georgia deserve safe, dignified jobs where their voices matter, their safety is protected, and their hard work is valued. We need the world's biggest auto companies to build the clean electric cars of the future, but we cannot repeat the shameful sins of the past, including prison labor, unsafe factories, and disrespect for workers in this new economy. So, to understand what these findings mean and how they fit into the longer history of labor in the South, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Will Tucker, who is a Southern director who leads our Southern program at Jobs to Move America. Will?
All right, thank you, Hewan. Welcome, everybody, and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. So as Hewan said, I'm Jobs to Move America's Southern Director. I'm based here in Birmingham, Alabama, where I'm coming to you from today, with our team of organizers and researchers. In 2022, our team began investigating prison labor in Alabama in earnest, and through public records requests, we started to see that automotive parts manufacturers and companies within one supply chain in particular were making extensive use of this system. That supply chain was Hyundai Kia's. And Hyundai Kia came to Alabama in 2005, but Alabama has a long history of allowing companies to experiment with coercive labor practices that stretches back much further than that. Since Reconstruction in the South after the Civil War, the South has been a testing ground for a number of captive and exploitative labor practices. Those include sharecropping, debt peonage, convict leasing, and then that was followed by a period of mechanization and surplusization and criminalization of poor communities and communities of color in particular. And in many ways, that criminalization led to a system of mass incarceration. And today we have a deadly and overcrowded and understaffed prison system. And within that prison system, we have a program that's officially known as work release, but which is really just a series of prison camps. It's a very important takeaway, prison work camps. And at these camps, the state makes available for private companies to employ thousands of incarcerated workers while they remain incarcerated. And so when we found that Hyundai Kia's supply chain was making extensive use of this system, we at JMA, our organizers and researchers in Alabama, set out to understand the impact of this system, not just on the incarcerated workers themselves, but also on the free world workers, as the incarcerated folks call them, that they're working right alongside on the manufacturing lines in these plants. And so we wanted to rigorously and objectively study the phenomenon, especially the impact on wages. And for that reason, we sought out top flight economists and sociologists to advise us. And that's how we found and came to partner here with Columbia Labor Lab, Dr. Nadeau, Dr. Helper, Dr. Reich, and Dr. Sojourner. And so as we did our work on the ground, locating and visiting and meeting incarcerated workers themselves through visits to the prison facilities, through mail, through visits to meet them where they were. That's how we came to meet several of these workers working for Hyundai and Kia suppliers, including a man named Mark Miller, who I'm sitting with right now and whom I'd like to introduce you to share a little bit about his experience working within this system. So I'll pass it to Mark.
So,
Go ahead. You're good.
Hi, my name is Mark Miller. I was incarcerated. I worked at Young through Frank Lee. I was put there. You have no choice. You have to go there and go to work. When I was there at Plant 2, I was there for 14 months. I got hurt on the job with my hand, snapped a bone. They bandaged me up and told me to keep on working. So I did. I run the parts that went up under the steering wheel. It had 6 components that I had to get in it quick and melt them and send them down the line. I run a whole line and they just kept pushing me faster and faster. It went from 600 parts up to 788 parts. And I had to try to remove bad parts, all this while I was doing my job. There was never no safety, none of this. I was trained maybe 10 minutes on the job, and I was told to do it and go as fast as I could go. And if I couldn't do my job, that they'd just call the camp and report it, and then the camp would write me up if I didn't do it and probably send me back to one of the dangerous prisons. So I had no choice in the matter. And then they transferred me over to Plant 1. It was a new plant. They was just getting it going. They didn't have no idea how to do it or keep on or keep the parts going. So they depended on us. There was 12 of us inmates out there. They depended on us to get the line set up and get them running. We was doing consoles that sat in the center of your vehicle. We had no training, no safety, no nothing. They said, just keep this line running and we're going to show you what to put on and how to do it. They showed us one time and there was no safety. Nothing was ever mentioned about safety. And one day, as I was working, I had to get a big box of parts in my arms. and I had to walk through 2 machines to get to where I needed to be. Somebody done put parts in the floor. I did not see them because I had my arms full. It was all the way up in front of my face. And I stepped on them. When I did, it flipped me forward and I fell into a steel rail and broke 4 of my ribs. There was a steel rail that held parts, a rack, and it hit me right here in the rib, broke 4 of my ribs. I was on the floor gasping for air. They said, we'll get him up front. We'll make a statement. I made a statement to Scott, told him exactly what happened, everything that happened, even witnesses seen it. And as I did, they said, well, we're going to call the ambulance. They called the state van, the state prison, told me that there's your ambulance. You're going back to the camp. So I went back to the camp. They x-rayed me. 4 of my ribs was broke, right here in the back part of my ribs. That's where I hit. When I did, they just put an ace bandage around me and told me when I heal up and I got the feeling better, that let them know, and they're going to put me right back to work. Before I even got healed, they made me go back to work. Because G Young was wanting me to, because I knew how to run that line. And then they used me for a gopher a lot. If I trained somebody on that line, they put me in the back doing cardboard. And if nobody showed up, I had to go back on the line. They put me in several different spots with no training. And if the machines tear up, there was no tag out, lockout. There was none of that. No safety precaution whatsoever. Forklifts flying by. I mean, as fast as they can go, getting parts off trucks, unloading trucks, trying to get them on the line. And then you almost getting run over every day, constantly. You had to keep your eyes. You was on your alert at all times. And drugs and alcohol there, really bad. Something I've never been around or worked around before in my life. I've been a painter for 45 years. I never got hurt on a job in my life till I went to G Young. There was just nothing unsafe there. And nothing was ever explained to you. It was just, I would never work there again.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. Hewan, we'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Mark, for sharing your story. So we will now hear from Dr. Suresh Naidu, the Jack Wang and Echo Ren Professor of Economics and Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, to speak directly about the report and its finding. Dr. Naidu?
Thanks. Thanks a lot for that. So I want to sort of frame this first as just saying that it's incredibly hard to study prison labor for obvious reasons, that it's a closed environment. It's difficult to get any data to come out of it. And so we're sort of deeply, as just researchers and academics, kind of very deeply appreciative of JMA and JMA's sort of commitment to kind of rigor and collecting kind of really good data and getting and working in and around the work release facilities and helping us sort of and giving us access to this data. So we kind of couldn't do this kind of project without them, and we're kind of just this is like a very kind of state-of-the-art work that JMA really helped us do. And so what do we find? We sort of find that, even when you just look at the free world workers, the non-incarcerated workers, we sort of find that the plants that are using a higher share of incarcerated workers have worse wages, worse working conditions. And in particular, so we kind of zoomed in on the factories that Will was talking about, that are the Hyundai Kia suppliers, which do have like a larger share of incarcerated workers than other plants. And we kind of show that those plants also kind of have lower wages and working conditions. And kind of in unpacking this, why this was going on is that it's that we kind of were able to use a property of the survey, where we kind of had these like hypothetical questions where you could ask people how likely would you be willing to quit in exchange for $1 less or $1 more or 20% less or 20% more. We could kind of measure how much free world workers versus incarcerated workers felt like they could quit. And we sort of definitely found very significant results that the incarcerated workers were much less likely to quit in response to a hypothetical wage cut. But we also found that free world workers also find it hard to quit, not as much as the incarcerated workers, but that's sort of very consistent with kind of a recent literature in economics, and that's kind of been taken up by the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, that really is looking at the exercise of labor market power and power in labor markets, which is called monopsony in economics. And basically, the idea there is that since the free world workers also find it hard to quit, and the suppliers and the plants that use incarcerated labor have access to this additional pool of workers that have an even harder time quitting, employers can profitably lower wages for both free and incarcerated workers. And the paper that the academic paper is kind of like really tracing out and trying to document that mechanism. And so I can go to the next slide, so just to put some numbers on these magnitudes. So basically, even before we look at Hyundai in particular, we find just in the Montgomery area where Hyundai is concentrated in public wages, not using anything about the survey JMA did, we find auto supplier wages are 7 to 9% lower in this public data. And then in the survey, we also then find that the Hyundai suppliers are earning like 10 to 15% less. And that's in that survey, we can kind of adjust for education and demographics, and we can compare them to other auto supply chain workers in Alabama. And so, we also had in the survey, JMA also asked about a whole variety of safety hazards, negative experiences. And we kind of found that the Hyundai suppliers were worse on all of those as well. So there's like more like unpaid wages, forced overtime, harassment, lack of breaks. All of those were also worse in these plants. And then just looking across the plants in general, not sort of singling out any one supply chain. We sort of just could find that the plants that kind of generally used more incarcerated labor had lower wages for the non-incarcerated workers in those plants. And so the magnitudes there, about a 10% increase in the share of incarcerated workers is associated with a 10 to 14% drop in wages for free workers. And we kind of try to assess the causality of that mechanism, kind of looking at the plants that are kind of very close to a work release facility versus plants that are further away. And we could talk about more of that in the Q&A, but I think I'll hand it over to Adam, who I think will give some background on the prison, the work release system in Alabama in general.
Yeah, thanks, Suresh, for that. The summary of our research. We're going to take a little bit of a step back now and sort of walk through both the historical context and then our findings in a bit more detail. So as Will Tucker mentioned, in the early 20th century, the state of Alabama operated the most profitable convict leasing system in the country. And it was the last state to formally end the practice in 1928. In many ways, prison work in Alabama looks very different today. The vast majority of those who are in the system do what's often called prison housework, mopping, working the kitchen, mowing the lawn, doing the laundry, the routine labor that keeps prisons running. But Alabama also operates 11 community-based facilities and community work centers that together hold about 10% of the state's incarcerated population. These are minimum security facilities that house people who then work outside of prison walls, either working for the state or for private employers. So formally, those who work for private industry have a choice about whether to do so. But in practice, as Mark Miller powerfully described, that choice is shaped by what they're choosing against. Alabama's prisons are extraordinarily violent and despairing places. The state's prison mortality rate is roughly 4 times that of the national average. And in 2019, the U.S. Department of Justice sued Alabama under the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act, the first time it had ever sued an entire state prison system. So given these background conditions, eligibility for work release is highly coveted. Work release facilities are far safer. Both deaths and death rates are an order of magnitude lower than in the general system. So from the employer's point of view, these workers, work release workers, look a lot like free world employees. They work on site, unsupervised by correctional staff, wearing civilian clothing. Regulations specify that the employer must pay for inmate labor in the same manner as for any employee and must comply with applicable requirements established by the Fair Labor Standards Act. Wages have to be equal to that of comparable workers and no less than the federal minimum wage. Yet this employment remains entirely mediated by the Department of Corrections. Those incarcerated do not apply directly to companies. Job placement officers assign them. Employers contract with the department, not with individuals. Wages are paid jointly to the inmate and the Department of Corrections, and incarcerated people never handle the checks themselves. After the department takes deductions, workers typically receive only about a third of their gross pay. So to summarize, two features of this system matter most for our analysis. First, participation is formally voluntary, but effectively coerced by the violence inside prisons. Second, employers must pay nominally comparable wages. Together, these are the features that help explain why employers' use of incarcerated labor can push down wages and working conditions for everyone. So finally, why do we focus here on Hyundai and Kia suppliers? In the Jobs to Move America survey, we find that Hyundai suppliers pay approximately 10 to 15% less than other auto suppliers. Public records and previous reporting show that Hyundai's network relies more heavily than other networks on incarcerated labor. And our analysis suggests that this reliance helps account for part of that wage gap. But I'm going to pass it off to Sue Helper now to explain how Hyundai and Kia's use of incarcerated labor is actually consistent with the U.S. autos industry's Southern strategy. Sue?
Yeah, thanks very much, Adam. I want to talk about today the auto industry is often thought of as a high wage employer. And it's important to understand how the industry got that way and how recent developments have undermined that. The high wage nature of the industry is not driven solely by some external technological imperative that's completely divorced from social structures. In fact, in the 1930s, the U.S. auto industry was characterized by brutal working conditions. So speed up, excessive heat, dangerous work, absolute power of supervisors to fire workers. In 1936, the workers in a GM plant in Flint, Michigan, staged the first sit-down strike. This and a bunch of other labor actions led to the recognition of the United Auto Workers Union, the UAW, by the largest U.S. automakers. And the result of this was a high wage, high productivity standard for the industry, where auto workers could buy a house, go on vacation, send their kids to college. In recent years, this model has been challenged by, among other factors, this Southern strategy that Adam referred to. And elements of this strategy are extensive use of subsidies from the state. So Alabama gave the four automakers in the state $2 billion over the last 20 years. In addition, tax abatements, weak health and safety regulation, and then seeking out these workforces with low bargaining power, not only prisoners, but children and immigrants, and then maintaining that bargaining power through anti-union efforts. I want to point out that this model has important differences from the way that Hyundai operates at home in Korea, where there's a strong auto workers union that has won significant wage increases over time. And so what I want to do now is, I guess, pass off to my colleague Aaron Sojourner Upjohn, and he's going to look at the impact of different features of this strategy.
Yeah, hi. JMA's history and relationships on the ground with auto workers and incarcerated workers in Central Alabama enabled them to collect a unique data set on worker experiences, and that's super valuable to the scholarly community. This, as Dr. Naidu said earlier, like it's very hard to measure these things. So they had staff visiting dozens of auto manufacturing plants around the region and beyond, at break times, at shift changes, to inform workers about the project, invite them to participate in the survey. And that included both free and incarcerated workers at these plants. They recruited Alabama auto manufacturing workers to the survey through Instagram and Facebook ads, and verified the plants that they worked at. And they basically sent the same survey on paper to residents of work release facilities with a stamped return envelope, and got responses from them. Some worked for auto manufacturing companies, some for others. But altogether, we had many hundreds of relevant workers that supplied data, and they each reported their wage, their working conditions, their work release status, education, experience, demographics. And we were worried about the representativeness of the sample because it's not a random sample. So, I think JMA did as much as they could to like get a great coverage of the sample, but we wanted to understand better what they got. So we compared it against two different comparable random samples that are of non-incarcerated workers that were taken by the census. It's the current population survey from 2024 and the American Community Survey from 2023. And there you can limit to the employers, to the employees of who are in Alabama, in the auto manufacturing industries, in production occupations. And we looked at their wages, their races, their ages, education levels, and gender, and we compared them. And the non-incarcerated workers in these official government surveys, these representative surveys, look very similar to the non-incarcerated JMA subsample. And really the JMA survey looks as much like either of the two official samples as the two official samples look to each other. So that gave us a lot of confidence that the surveys were measuring the same population very well. One of those official surveys is reported in the public-facing report. Both of them are in that report in the academic report. The JMA survey was special, though, because it asked about these economically critical questions, Suresh said, that are missing from government surveys about each worker's willingness to quit in response to hypothetical wage cuts of various sizes. And that enables the measurement of differences in the free and incarcerated workers' attachment to their employer. And these differences in sensitivity to wages and working conditions and their willingness to put up with these worse conditions really matter to model and understand the economic effects of employer access to incarcerated labor. So any of us would bet, anybody here who you asked would bet that incarcerated workers are less sensitive to wage cuts than free workers, because of the terrible risks of violence in the general population prisons. It makes work release a valuable escape. And also that Department of Corrections garnishes wages a huge share, so that lowers the bite of lower wages for them. We could all guess the direction of this difference, but no one's ever measured the magnitude of the difference before. And the magnitude of the difference is critical for predicting the effects, to which employer access reduces the wages and well-being of free workers. And it also is critical to modeling the impact of policies like freeing work release prisoners, or eliminating the work release program, or putting in a general higher minimum wage, or putting in a voluntary minimum wage by Hyundai Kia that they could enforce on their suppliers and their contractors. So in the academic paper, we model those things, and they're discussed briefly in the public-facing report. We also brought in a lot of other public data to contextualize the survey and build broader analysis. I'll hold off on details, but happy to go deep if anybody wants. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Sojourner, and thank you to all of our speakers. So we will now identify questions from the Q&A list. And if folks have not yet entered a question and you want to direct it to a particular speaker, please indicate that in the Q&A section of this page. So the first question that was asked, and this is specifically to Mark Miller, is what time period did you participate in work release, and in particular Juyong, which you shared your experience at, and also when did you begin your parole?
I started at Juyong in 2022, and when the last time I got hurt was with my back out there lifting stuff I didn't supposed to be lifting, but I had to. That was 2024. I was there for 2 years. I was at plant 2 for 14 months, then plant 1 for 10 months. Then I got hurt, and then they knew I was coming up for parole. So they just didn't even put me back to work, and I made parole. And then I had to go to a program in Selma. I done a 90-day program there, and I came home April the 4th.
Thank you. The next question is, are the authors of the study able to show causality? For example, can the analysis show that the lower wages are a product of the higher shares of incarcerated workers versus lower productivity, more unsafe suppliers, needing to rely more heavily on incarcerated work release laborers?
Yeah, so thanks for that. I can take that question. So yeah, so we're clearly worried about causality because obviously the plants that use incarcerated workers might be different on any number of characteristics that might also vary, like just worse health and safety standards, lower productivity, et cetera, as you said. So the way that we address this is by looking at the distance that the different plants are from work release facilities. And basically the idea is that all these other characteristics probably shouldn't vary with the distance to one of these prison camps or the work release facilities. And what we can show is that the plants that are sort of closer to the work release facilities do indeed use more incarcerated labor and also have lower wages for non-incarcerated workers. And so we think that mechanism really sort of isolates that it's through that at least one of the channels through which they're paying lower wages to the non-incarcerated workers is by the use of incarcerated workers, because the idea is that all these other things are kind of independent of their distance from a work release facility. And when distance really bites in this context, because you have to get buses, you have to have the relationships between the ADOC wardens and the plant managers. And so, being closer to just physically to one of these work release facilities really does mean that you wind up using more work release workers on the shop floor. And then we're sort of showing that is also then driving the lower wages. So that's kind of, I think it's pretty good. Of course, it's not perfect, but it's kind of how we tried to establish causality.
Thank you, Dr. Naidu. And this question is also for anyone who wants to take it. So why did this report focus on Hyundai Kia?
Okay, I'll take this one also. So I think it's partly that we were, that the survey sort of context was, Alabama and Central and South Alabama in particular, and in the auto sector, and that's just kind of where Hyundai is, but it's a natural thing to focus on for the use of incarcerated workers. Just also given, I think, the New York Times coverage and previous reporting on this. So I think in some ways, like the Hyundai is the focus on Hyundai is almost a product of the environment and survey that were that was done, rather than like a necessarily ex ante specific like target. But we're obviously operating in this area and looking at kind of auto suppliers, but of course the dominant supply chain is Hyundai. And so I think, there was basically it was where the survey was done, and we did sort of expect to find this based on the reporting that had happened, but it sort of came out from the data rather than necessarily being a place that we were like starting from.
And I can just add that JMA had submitted several FOIA requests, and so we had a database of the sort of employers that were making use of work release inmates, and so we connected those employers to a database through Dun & Bradstreet and looked at the share of workers in work release by industries, and what part of the state they were in. And so it is true that work release inmates work at a wide variety of different employers, but if you look at like what share they make up the highest proportion, like what industries they make up the highest proportion of, it is the auto supply. It's the auto supply industry, and if you look at where they're most highly concentrated, it's in the Montgomery area, which is where the Hyundai plant is based. And so these are also sort of helped us feel confident that Hyundai was kind of did make use of incarcerated labor, and likely did so more than other auto suppliers.
Thank you. So the next question I have here is, what oversight exists to prevent companies from using prison labor as a disposable workforce without accountability for injuries or long-term health impacts? Could I ask Sue to take that question?
Sue, you're
You're
muted.
muted.
Can you unmute?
I think that oversight is fairly minimal, as Mark's testimony indicates. And I think in other states, you might see both a very active state agency spending money. You might also see a key role of unions as often advocating for workers in these situations. And so those mechanisms are much weaker in Alabama.
Thanks, Sue. And if I may jump in and add to that, I think this brings into really stark relief how critically important it is that companies actually make strong commitments to communities and to workers to take steps to make jobs better and safer and more accessible to folks in the communities. And that includes incarcerated workers. There's one outcome of oversight that we don't necessarily want to see is the workers like Mark, here with me, just being sent back into the more dangerous close and medium security facilities in Alabama. Rather, we think, wages, working conditions, safety needs to improve for all workers. And companies have a really important role, including Hyundai Kia, in making the commitments to the communities and workers and holding themselves accountable to that and to improve the conditions for all workers. They have a really important role here to do that.
Thank you. And I think we answered this a bit, but maybe we could flesh it out a little bit, is who else uses prison labor in Alabama besides Hyundai Kia? And does it quantify how much more extensive it is at Hyundai versus other OEMs?
So, there's in the survey, we measured workers at these different plants reported their incarceration status, and the we also classified each employer by whether they were Hyundai, the main assembly plant, a different main assembly plant, or auto supply plant, not the main assemblers, but the the supply chain leading up to them. And what we found was that it's there's not much use of prison labor in the main assembly plants. It's really concentrated in the auto supply sector, the smaller employers who feed materials up into the assembly plant. And in the survey, it looks like the auto suppliers who supply Hyundai were about twice, had double the share of the other auto suppliers in terms of their use of incarcerated labor. If you look at the at other sources of information, you get similar disproportionality. It's much more concentrated among suppliers of Hyundai than the other brands. The shares are not huge. Like the vast majority of workers in the industries are free world workers, but even small shares of incarcerated workers can have effects on free workers.
Thank you. And so another question here is, has Hyundai made any demonstrable efforts to improve the situation since these allegations surfaced? Specifically regarding the reports last year, their supplier would terminate contracts. Is the use of incarcerated labor still ongoing within the supply chain as of 2025? And I believe that there's been a few questions related to that.
I can briefly respond to that. Public records indicate yes, that as of recently, this is still an ongoing phenomenon within the supply chain. I would also add that, and in Mark's experience and the experience of many other workers last year, and I would refer everybody to not only the first New York Times story that came out last year, but the second, to understand how the company responded to workers speaking up about working conditions, including safety. We can, I'm sure, link that story from the Times from late last year in the chat or follow up with it later.
Okay, the next question here is, does Hyundai Kia also manage the plants in its supply chain using incarcerated labor in the style of South Korean chaebols?
Yeah, I can take that one. So Hyundai has long-standing relationships with its suppliers, both in Korea and the U.S. Sometimes these relationships involve a minority equity stake. Other times they don't. But in both cases, there's a fairly large literature in Korea and just globally about these relationships, particularly when a supplier comes to the U.S. It's a big investment, and so there's a lot of reliance on Hyundai as a customer. Hyundai in Korea also, as I mentioned, has this long-term relationship. They have provided a lot of financing help, a lot of technical assistance to these suppliers. For many decades, they've supported the stability and growth of these parts makers. So it would be hard to believe that the labor strategy of Hyundai supplier in the U.S. is independent of the wishes of the parent company. It's also clear that one reason, and there's public statements about that the sort of flexible and right to work nature of Alabama is a key reason why Hyundai came to Alabama.
Thank you so much. There's another question here that asks, how does this report related to the new HBO documentary, The Alabama Solution? Are you saying that these workers are fleeing the violence described in the Alabama prison system by working at these companies?
though I have not seen the documentary, so I cannot exactly relate it to that. But I do think the mechanism is sort of consistent with this like idea that the general population prison conditions are horrendous in Alabama, and really like exceptionally horrendous in Alabama, and the work release facilities are safer than the general population prisons, and working in the plants is safer than any of those, either of those two things. So it makes there's this pressure to like get out from the prison facilities that makes it that you know the workers are really kind of, you know, incarcerated workers really kind of like with you know are trying to get out and get into the workforce, and that's one of the mechanisms that dampens the wages.
Okay, here, I have another question. Don't other automakers use these practices also? And why are you focused on Hyundai Kia? If you had surveyed areas where other automakers have their supply chains, wouldn't you have found similar levels of prison labor?
I mean, the survey did extend into parts of the state close to some of the other main assembly plants, and we did not find as high level of reported, you know, use of incarcerated labor in those plants. The rate was, again, about twice as high among Hyundai assemblers as, sorry, among Hyundai auto supply employers compared to other auto suppliers that were supplying other companies. And as Suresh said, you know, distance really matters in these things. And so, you know, we think we've developed some strong evidence here that the impacts of using incarcerated labor are negative on free worker wages and well-being. And, you know, Hyundai suppliers are the ones who are disproportionately benefiting from that by suppressing wages. And so, yeah, we did see, and we also use public data to compare the gap between assemblers, plants, assembly plants, and auto supply plants in the Montgomery area, where, you know, centered around Hyundai assembly versus other parts of Alabama and neighboring states. And we found that, and the reason we looked at that is because basically none of the assembly plants use incarcerated labor in a meaningful way. It's too reputationally risky for the brand. But some of the suppliers do, and some don't. And we see that in a lot more do in the Montgomery area. And those are the suppliers who are supplying Hyundai. So by comparing the gap between the assembly plant wages and the supplier plant wages, that tells you it's bigger in Montgomery area than other parts of the state or neighboring states. And that means that something's different there. And part of what's different there, and we think a key part of what's different there, is the use of incarcerated labor.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our speakers and for you all for participating in today's press conference. So for follow-up questions, please contact Lara Berkfold. Her contact information is in the chat. And thank you for your time and your attention. This concludes today's press conference.